Lansing School District families and community stakeholders, welcome to our Parent University session entitled Suicide Intervention and Prevention. My name is Kyron Harvell. I'm the director of the STAR grant. STAR stands for School Transformation Accelerates Results. We are very fortunate this evening to have Mr. Corbin Standley of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. He's going to provide an excellent overview, and we look forward to his presentation. Thank you, Mr. Standley. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end of his presentation. I will now turn to Mr. Standley. And again, thank you for joining us at Penn University.
All right, thank you. First, I want to thank the Lansing School District for having me here this evening and for all of you for joining for this important topic. My name is Corbin Standley. I am the chairman of the board of directors for the Michigan chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We're a national nonprofit organization with chapters in all 50 states, and our mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. And I hope to share a bit more about what we do to do that throughout the country and here in the state of Michigan. I am also a researcher at Michigan State University. My research focuses on youth suicide prevention, and I'm also pursuing my PhD there as well. So today's conversation is going to be sort of a broad overview of suicide prevention and how we can recognize the warning signs and risk factors in our young people and what we can do to have a conversation with them about what we might be noticing. I want to recognize that suicide is a sensitive topic to discuss, but in talking about it, we know that we can prevent it. And so I'm grateful that you've decided to join this conversation. If at any point during the presentation you feel the need to step away, please feel free to do that. I do want to make sure that you're all comfortable during this presentation as well. Overall, we hope that you're able to learn more about suicide prevention from today's presentation and become more comfortable talking about the important issue of suicide prevention in our schools, in our families, and in our communities. Before I dive into the content specifically, I do want to mention that we have a wealth of knowledge and resources on our website, specifically about mental health and COVID-19. There's been a lot of press around the issue of mental health and COVID-19, and we are encouraged to see that it is part of the current conversation. We have also seen some reporting that suggests that suicides are increasing as a result of the pandemic, and I want to emphasize that the data in Michigan and nationally do not support that. The data we currently have does not suggest that suicides have increased as a result of the pandemic, and that's an important thing to mention. But despite that, we still have risk factors and warning signs and things that we can look out for to prevent suicide in our young people and more broadly across the community. So I encourage you to visit our website at afsp.org/COVID-19 for some COVID-19 specific resources, blog posts, and a number of other resources that are available on that website. So to start off with, suicide is a complex health issue, but despite this complexity, we know that suicide can be prevented. Just as there are warning signs for things like health crises, such as cardiac arrest, we can learn the warning signs and risk factors that can help us to prevent somebody from dying by suicide. And as with other health issues, prevention can start early, far in advance of the problem, or prevention can occur closer to the time of crisis. And we know that time can be a critical and life-saving measure. Typically, we know that a life can be saved if you allow time for the person's suicidal crisis to subside or to help them get through that period of distress and to get the mental health care that they might need. And to prevent suicide, we need to be able to identify people who may be at risk for suicide, as well as take an active role in connecting them to help before they take action to end their lives. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that here today. So the purpose of Talk Saves Lives is to provide community members, parents, and educators with a general overview about suicide, who it affects, and what can be done to prevent it. The presentation will cover some statistics to give you an idea of the scope of the issue of suicide. We will review some key research findings, including the risk and protective factors that are related to suicide. And we'll talk about what works and what we can all do to prevent this leading cause of death among our students and among ourselves and our community members. But first, how we talk about suicide matters. So I want to go over some terminology that's used when we talk about suicide, because it's important to model appropriate language so that we don't perpetuate the stigma of suicide or mental health conditions. And so let's establish a baseline of shared language on this topic. We avoid the phrase committed suicide as it has a negative connotation that's often associated with crime. So instead, we encourage the phrase died by suicide, ended their life, or killed themselves. When talking about suicide and suicide attempts, we avoid referring to them as successful or failed, not only because it's unnecessary, but also because these words imply judgment. And so instead, we just encourage the phrase suicide attempt, suicide, or death by suicide. Educating the public about suicide is critical to encourage help-seeking behaviors, to raise awareness of risk in vulnerable populations, and to advocate for new interventions and prevention strategies that help to combat that risk. So when suicide is talked about safely and accurately, we can help reduce the likelihood of its occurrence. And this is just one of many steps that we can take to end the stigma around suicide and mental health. We want to change the way society understands these things because when we open up and when we connect, we know that talk saves lives. We know that suicide is a significant issue that affects individuals, families, and communities worldwide. So let's start with some statistics that demonstrate the scope of the problem. We know that suicide is a global issue, and according to the World Health Organization, each year we lose over 800,000 people to suicide. And while this is the most accurate data we have available, we estimate that the numbers are actually higher because suicide is underreported in many countries and many communities around the world. This works out to one suicide about every 40 seconds globally around the world. And we know in the United States that suicide rates are recorded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And according to the CDC, about over 47,000 people died by suicide in 2019, which is the year for which we have the most recent data. The data on this slide is from 2018, and we actually know that the national suicide rate decreased slightly between 2018 and 2019 for the first time in over 20 years. And so that's very encouraging, but it means that we have a lot more work to do. And suicide remains the 10th leading cause of death in the United States and here in the state of Michigan. We know that suicide takes more lives in the US than homicide, war, and natural disasters combined. And these numbers are some of the many reasons that it's important to talk about suicide like we talk about any other cause of death. The more we talk, the less stigmatized the idea that we all face struggles and need support becomes, and the more we can do to help encourage people to talk about it. We also know that for every death by suicide, it's estimated that 25 others attempt. So that's about 1 million Americans every year who survive a suicide attempt. And that provides us with a critical intervention point for potentially saving more lives. When you think about any loss, its impact also affects many people across communities, and suicide is no different. The loss affects family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, schools, faith communities, and it's estimated that the majority of Americans will experience a suicide loss at some point in their lifetime. And so let's move on to talking about research. Now that we've talked about sort of the community impact and the global impact, the statistical impact, over the last few decades, researchers have been studying suicide, and research is shedding light on many of the critical areas, including what drives up risk, what that amounts to in terms of effective suicide prevention. And we still have a lot more to learn. So this section provides an overview of some of the research around suicide, some of the key findings, and some of the future goals in the field of suicidology. One of the main questions we explore as researchers is why do people take their own lives? And through research, we have learned that there is no single cause for suicide. Suicide most often occurs when several stressors and health issues converge to create an experience of hopelessness and despair in an individual. And we find this to be true for youth as well, that there's never one single cause for suicide, but there's often a sort of a conglomeration of multiple factors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Research has consistently shown that the large majority of people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of their death. And it may or may not be recognized by the person or the loved one, and it may not be diagnosed or treated, but we do know that the majority have some sort of mental health condition at the time of their death. That said, research has also made clear that mental health conditions cannot be the whole story. The vast majority of people who have mental health conditions do not go on to die by suicide. And a report by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 2018 talked about some of the other conditions that can contribute to suicide risk, including relationship issues, discrimination and oppression, financial strain, and any other number of social and societal factors that can also contribute to suicide. And so mental health is one big piece of the puzzle, but it's certainly not the whole thing. And in addition to mental health conditions and some of these social and societal factors, there are many other factors that can increase risk as well. We've learned that the brains of those who die by suicide differ from those who die from other causes of death in terms of structure and function, specifically in the areas related to stress response and impulse control. And so there are some neuroscience studies that look at physical structures in the brain that might differ among those who die by suicide. And this isn't necessarily the case for all those who die by suicide, but there is some emerging research on this topic as well. We've also learned that most people who are suicidal are ambivalent about taking their life. Part of them wants to live, and that's the part we really want to sort of connect with. It's not that they want to die, it's that they don't know how to live with what they're currently experiencing, and that's a really important point. And this research has informed some key strategies in suicide prevention that involves engaging that part of the person that wants to live and helping to create the distance from the pain and struggle that might be facilitating thoughts of suicide. And so one way we do that is to help the person to connect with reasons for living, while at the same time decreasing the visibility and presence of stressors and risk factors around them that might be contributing to their suicidal ideation. And so we know that it's not necessarily that somebody wants to die. Again, it's that they don't know how to live with what they're currently experiencing. And that provides, again, another critical intervention point for helping somebody who might be in crisis. One of the many important things we've learned from suicide research is about the perspective of a suicidal person. We know that for them, a crisis point has been reached, and for that suicidal person, the pain seems unbearable, whether that's emotional pain, physical pain, or sometimes both. And so for a moment, I'd like you to think back to the most painful experience of your life. And at that moment, you likely would not have been able to provide directions to someone's house or to your own house. And so this is sort of an illustration that pain can make ordinary thinking impossible. And so for a suicidal person, thinking becomes constricted at that moment of crisis. There's sort of this state of intense tunnel vision where other options seem unavailable. And this can be particularly present for youth who do not have a fully formed frontal cortex in their brain. And so some of these impulse controls and some of that tunnel vision can be exacerbated among youth. And so understanding this perspective of a suicidal person has helped us to learn that suicidal feelings are often temporary, and they can come on immensely and can sometimes pass in minutes or hours. So keeping people safe and helping them feel supported can get them through those critical moments. And there is also evidence that putting time and distance between an individual who is suicidal and the means they may take to end their life can be a life-saving action. And we'll talk specifically about that in a moment as well. And so this is why it's so important that we take steps to know when somebody is struggling so we can do all we can to keep them safe. Research has also helped us to determine some of the key factors that can increase risk for suicide. And these are particularly important for youth, as we know that youth spend a lot of their times in schools, but they also spend a lot of time with family, in their communities, with friends. And while that can look a little bit different over the last year, there are multiple contexts in which youth interact with others. And some of these key risk factors can be present in multiple contexts. And so risk factors are defined as the characteristics or conditions that increase the chance that a person may take their life. Risk factors are important to know to understand the big picture of someone who is considering suicide. And so just like someone who is at risk for heart disease because of high blood pressure or a history of heart disease in the family, some people are at higher risk for suicide than others. And the main risk factors shown here can be grouped into three categories. Those are health factors, historical factors, and environmental factors. And these risk factors can converge at different times in life and increase a person's risk for suicidal behavior at particular points in time. For example, the environmental factors for youth may include a specific classroom or the school context. More generally, historical factors can include a family history of mental health conditions. And then you have health factors, both physical and mental health, that can impact suicide among youth. And so diving specifically into health factors, the first type of risk factor, we know that there are biological and psychological medical conditions that are related to suicide, the most significant of which are mental health conditions. And as I said before, most people who die by suicide have an active mental health problem at the time of their death, though this is not necessarily the case for everybody. And depression is the most common mental health condition and the one that is most often associated with suicide. Bipolar disorder is also shown to be a high-risk condition that is also associated with depression and suicide. And because these conditions put a person at greater risk for suicide, detecting the presence of a mental health condition is critically important. And so the best way to be sure when you're feeling concerned or you detect a possible change in you or your loved one's mental health is for the person to seek a professional evaluation and effective treatment, be that from a school counselor or a school psychologist, or from your family's primary care physician, or somebody else who might be able to help your child understand what they're experiencing. And many people may not realize that their distress has actually become a health problem. So providing information about how to access mental health care or a crisis number if they're in distress can be a solid step in helping them to connect with people, to connect them with people who can help. One of the ways that we've done this is last year we worked with Representative Schroeder in the state legislature to pass the Save Our Students Act, and that requires that effective next year, schools that serve students in grades 6 through 12 will be required to print a suicide prevention hotline phone number on all student ID cards. And that's just one step that we can take to provide resources to those who might be struggling. And so we'll talk more about referring to services and effective treatment later in the discussion when we talk about prevention. But as I said, mental health conditions are not the only health factors that are associated with suicide risk. We also know that serious or chronic health conditions can increase risk, especially when the person also has mental health issues. And so chronic pain and serious head injuries have also been found to increase suicide risk. The second type of risk factors include historical factors, and this includes things like a family history of suicide, a family history of mental health conditions, past trauma such as sexual abuse or combat stress. Research has also found that a history of childhood abuse can also contribute to suicide risk. And while most people who attempt suicide do not go on to die by suicide, previous suicide attempts are also considered a historical risk factor for suicide and put a person at increased risk as well. The final type of risk factors are environmental factors. And so these are the circumstances in a person's life that might increase risk for suicide. Often there are aspects of a person's environment that can contribute to their risk. And so let's look, sorry about that. So let's look at some of the most common environmental factors. Having access to a way to kill oneself is referred to as having access to lethal means. And this includes having access to a variety of things, including firearms, drugs, a bridge, a car, those sorts of things. And research has also shown that contagion, or the exposure to another person's suicide, or to graphic sensationalized accounts of suicide, especially among those with similar risk factors, can increase a person's risk for suicide. So, for example, we do a lot of work with media outlets to talk about safe messaging when reporting on celebrity suicides, because we know that there can be a risk for contagion when they're not reported safely. We also know that prolonged stress, including harassment, bullying, relationship problems, legal issues, and employment, all can be related to suicide risk as well. And when we talk about bullying, it's important to note that there's sort of a nuance in the research regarding bullying and suicide. So we know that those who are bullied are at increased risk for suicide, but it's also true that bullies themselves and witnesses to bullying are also at increased risk for suicide. And it's also important to recognize that suicide is not necessarily a natural response to bullying. And so while it's important to address the issue of bullying, and that's something we absolutely advocate for, bullying is very rarely the one thing that caused a suicide. And we want to be mindful that it's always sort of this combination of risk factors that come together to create risk for suicide. And so we want to avoid assigning blame to specific individuals or to bullying when a suicide does occur, because we know it's just one of many risk factors, although it might be one of the leading ones. It's important to recognize that there is sort of some nuance in the research that we want to be mindful of, and that bullies and witnesses to bullying are also at increased risk. And then finally, stressful events, which can vary across the lifespan, including things like divorce, legal issues, job loss, can all increase risk for suicide as well. So to better understand a suicide risk in a particular individual, this is an example of a set of risk factors that can converge in a person who is suicidal. We may see a person who is in distress. For example, maybe this student experienced bullying within the school. And we tend to attribute bullying as the cause for that death. But what we may not know is that there may have been a genetic risk for suicide. That student may have been diagnosed with depression. They may have been experiencing some prolonged stress in the classroom. They may have been engaging in risky behaviors. These are some things that can increase risk for suicide. And again, it's this combination of risk factors that can converge to create suicide risk. So I tend to talk about suicide risk as sort of a glass of water that's full to the brim. And then you add a drop of water to that glass and that glass overflows. And as a society, we tend to blame that one drop of water for that glass overflowing rather than looking at everything that was already in that glass. And so that's how we want to think about suicide risk, that there's this number of risk factors that can be mitigated to help prevent risk for suicide. And we'll talk a little bit about what those mean in a moment. We know that this sort of one cause, be it bullying, a relationship issue, is never the full story. And so the key is that combination of risk factors that could have contributed to a suicide death. And so looking to the future, research will help us to find more ways to fight suicide. Some research is looking at biomarkers, for example, that's something that might be testable in the blood that would help us to identify somebody who might be at risk. There are a number of clinical treatments like therapy that are effective for suicidal people, and more are being developed and studied. We are also looking at effective programs and interventions to reduce suicide risk. My own research looks at school-based programs and community-level programs that can prevent suicide among youth. And we're also learning more about medication and the role of medication in reducing risk for suicide, particularly in combination with psychotherapy and other types of psychological treatments as well. So now that we have a better understanding of the scope of the issue and some of the research findings, including risk factors, the next section will talk about prevention. We'll talk about the types of protective factors with a focus on mental health. We'll talk about the importance of engaging in self-care, the need to provide support for suicide loss survivors and those with lived experience, and we'll talk about some critical prevention strategies, including limiting access to lethal means. So just like there are risk factors that increase a person's risk for suicide, there are also protective factors that can lower a person's risk. And this is where a lot of my research focuses as well. And we know that if you're proactive about mental health and make an effort to get healthier, you can protect yourself and others can protect themselves. And so one of the things that research has found is that feeling supported and connected to family and community can protect against suicide. When somebody is struggling with depression, anxiety, psychosis, substance use, these protective factors that may normally be strong can erode and temporarily weaken. And so when that happens, having friends and family to remind us of our strengths can be a tremendous protective factor. Problem-solving skills also help. Life can get really tough, especially in the midst of a pandemic and other social issues that we've been living through, but being able to see a way through problems can also be a protective factor. And so, for example, resilience is a protective factor for suicide as well. We also know that cultural and religious beliefs that encourage connecting and help seeking and discourage suicidal behavior or create that strong sense of purpose can also be a protective factor. I will also mention that while religious beliefs can be protective for a lot of people, religion can also be a risk factor for some communities, especially for those in the LGBTQ plus community who may not feel supported and may feel alienated by a religion. That can actually be a risk factor, but other people can find it to be protective. So it's important to mention that just like risk is individual, protective factors are also individual and will vary by person, but these are some of the broader categories that tend to be protective. So because mental health care is so important for preventing suicide, I'm going to focus on this topic for the next few minutes. We know that getting effective treatment for mental health conditions like depression or anxiety can prevent suicide. And critical to suicide prevention is getting people connected to mental health treatment. One of the biggest challenges in fighting suicide is getting people to address their mental health in the same way that they would address their physical health. In fact, of those suffering from a mental health condition, less than half seek treatment. And one way to encourage individuals to seek help for their mental health conditions is to treat mental health like every other aspect of our health. There are certain times when a person becomes ill or has a chronic health condition to manage, and it's critical to seek a trained professional in those situations. And we need to create a culture where everyone knows it's smart to take care of our mental health, and again, to elevate mental health to the same level as physical health. We also know that taking care of our mental health is just as important as taking care of our physical health. This is a point I'm going to drive home multiple times. And seeing a mental health professional is a sign of strength, and we know that many are taking that step. The person seeking help should request a thorough evaluation and figure out if there's a mental health condition affecting their life. And again, this will vary by school or community if we're talking about students in particular, but there are many types of treatments available like psychotherapy and medications, and research has shown that for many people the combination of both tends to be the most helpful. But the most important thing, again, is to find the treatment that works best for the individual, especially when it comes to youth. Family therapy can be a particularly helpful strategy, but it's about finding what works best for that particular individual. And it may take a while to find the right provider, to find the right medication, to find the right balance. But finding what works best for that individual is the best thing we can do to help those who might be struggling. The good news is that advocacy efforts are improving access to mental health services so that more people can get the treatment they need. The law does currently require that insurance plans cover mental health services on par with physical health services. This was as a result of the Affordable Care Act. We are working at the state level and at the federal level to make sure that this is enforced. While the Affordable Care Act does currently mandate that insurance plans cover mental health in the same way they cover physical health, there's not much language in the legislation to hold insurance payers accountable to that. And so something we're working on at the state level and at the federal level is mental health parity legislation to make sure that insurers are actually doing this. And we know that if we need mental health services and one out of 4 of us will need those services at some point in our lives, we should get treated and get our health back on track faster. And so we're doing all we can to make sure that that's happening, but the law does currently require it. And just like people can find strategies that optimize their physical health, people can do the same for their mental health. So in addition to professional mental health care, protective self-care strategies like good sleep habits, exercise, nutrition, stress management, can also play a critical role in protecting mental health and promoting resilience. And some of these are easier than others, but it's important to engage in these healthy self-care behaviors, even if it's taking on one at a time. Maybe, you focus on getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night, and slowly start to incorporate these things in your lives or in the lives of your children and help them to develop some of these self-care strategies. And we know that can be very protective and an effective way to manage our mental health. Prevention efforts also include support for those who are touched by suicide. The loss of one person to suicide profoundly impacts many, and it's important that survivors have the support that they need, both to heal and to reduce their own suicide risk. And since those with lived experience, those who have attempted suicide or have experienced suicidal thinking are at increased risk, we need to make sure that they also have the support that they need as well. For people who are at that crisis point, the most important thing you can put between a suicidal person and their way of ending their life is time. Research shows that by temporarily reducing a person's access to lethal means, we give suicidal individuals time for the intense suicidal risk to diminish, and time for someone to intervene with mental health support and resources. For the majority of people who experience a suicidal crisis, even if unable to access their chosen method, even temporarily, they are unlikely to engage in another action to end their lives. And this is one of the myths that we see out there, is that if we, for example, secure a firearm, they'll find some other way to end their life. And the research shows that that's not the case. Sort of going back to some of the research, we know that for a suicidal person, they've reached this crisis point and this period of tunnel vision where they can't necessarily think logically or see a way out. And so we know that if we increase their safety and decrease access to lethal means, they're very unlikely to find another way to end their lives. We'll talk a little bit about access to lethal means next. And again, in most cases, when a suicidal person doesn't have current access to the means that has been on their mind, they typically do not substitute with another method. And so this is a clear way to prevent suicide, is, again, limiting access to lethal means. We know that during a period of high risk, the safer the environment is, the better chance that a suicidal person has of living through that crisis period. Suicide prevention research has looked at a number of ways that we can create safer environments. For example, installing an inexpensive carbon monoxide sensor that would automatically shut off cars if that level reached an unsafe point would help to save lives. We've learned through research that installing barriers on bridges deters suicides, and in many cases, bridge barriers actually lowered the suicide rate for an entire region. We know that restricting access to potentially lethal medications can also reduce suicides and can be as simple as requiring that lethal drugs be sold in blister packaging. And this also includes locking up your own medications in your home. And we also know that firearm safety is critical to reducing suicide rates. In the US, firearms are used in roughly half of all suicides, making suicide prevention an important part of gun safety education. And so this isn't about taking away firearms, but it's about making sure that firearms are stored safely and securely, that ammunition is locked up separately from the firearm itself, and that you have conversations with those in your household about firearm safety and the importance of keeping those things, keeping firearms stored. And there are a number of organizations that provide free gun locks and safety education classes. And we also have some education from our organization that talks specifically about firearm safety as well. And as noted already, and contrary to what many people think, when access to lethal means are limited, most people who are suicidal do not find other means. And so this is a critical thing that we can do to help prevent suicide. And so now that we've talked about some prevention efforts, let's talk about what we can all do within our homes, within our communities, and within our schools to help prevent suicide. It's important to have a caring, supportive conversation with somebody you might be worried about, whether that be one of your children, one of your students, anybody you may come in contact with. If you're worried about them and what they're experiencing, share that with them. A conversation is a way to show that you care and allows you to gain more information about their level of distress. So how do you have that conversation? We'll start by talking about some of the warning signs to look out for. And these are a little bit different from risk factors. While many of the suicide risk factors we discussed endure over a long period of time, warning signs are the observable signs that signal suicide risk is in the near future. And it's important to pay attention to both risk factors that we discussed before and the warning signs that we'll talk about now. And if you see these warning signs, reach out to that person in your life that you're concerned about, and reach out to others if you yourself are struggling. And then finally, seek mental health services if you're depressed or if your anxiety regularly interferes with your daily life, and encourage others to do the same as well. So suicide warning signs are typically displayed in three main ways that we can detect, and those are talk, behavior, and mood. And we'll discuss each of these ways in a bit more detail. Many people who are suicidal talk about ending their lives, and this can be directly or indirectly. A person might say it outright, or they might joke about it. And it's important to take it seriously every single time it's mentioned. Some people say they have no reason to live. Others say things that let you know they may feel trapped or that they're a burden to others, or they might talk about being in unbearable or overwhelming pain. And so it's important to take any mention of suicide seriously, because it's always better to overreact to nothing than to underreact to something. Behaviors that are atypical for an individual person should also encourage you to speak to them about what you're noticing. And again, this is very individual, but people thinking about suicide can display certain behaviors. They may be experiencing increased use of alcohol or drugs. They may have trouble sleeping. They may be sleeping too much. They may start acting more recklessly. They may be driving without a seatbelt, spending money recklessly. They might withdraw from activities they typically used to engage in or enjoy. They might isolate themselves from family or friends. And this can be a little harder to detect when we're all sort of socially distancing. But just making sure that you keep an eye out for some of those behavior changes is really important. They might be also looking for methods or means to die by suicide. And so it's important to make sure that, again, those lethal means are restricted and locked up safely. And they may also be giving away their possessions or, again, engaging in reckless spending, giving away things. All of these things are, again, individual behaviors that you want to look out for that deviate from the typical behavior for that particular person. People at risk for suicide can also often display some of these moods, and this might be subtly as well. Depression, apathy, rage, irritability, impulsivity, humiliation, anxiety. These are moods that one would expect someone who feels overwhelmed and desperate might experience. And we all have ups and downs in our mood, especially during, adolescence. We can see mood swings and stuff that are typical for a teenager. But when you notice a change that seems uncharacteristic or concerning, it's important to speak to that person about what you're noticing. So, for example, a sudden unexplained happiness might indicate that an individual has decided on a plan and is relieved that they're no longer in pain. So, especially if that unexplained happiness follows a prolonged period of depression or anxiety, that's a sign that you should reach out and have a conversation with that person. So that was a lot of things to talk about when it comes to risk factors and warning signs. And so to sum up, you want to look for changes in behaviors and you want to trust your instincts. It's not about looking for a certain number of risk factors over a certain period of time combined with this number of warning signs over that same period of time, but it's about trusting your gut and making sure that you reach out and have a conversation with somebody you might be concerned about. Assume you're the only one who's going to reach out. And in many instances, people talked about their concern for someone amongst themselves, but hesitated to reach out to that person directly. So this is the kind of rule of thumb. If you are wondering if someone is depressed or overly anxious, that's a sure sign that you should reach out. And the same goes for you. If you are having suicidal thoughts or you are experiencing some of these warning signs, that's a sure sign that you should also reach out and seek some help. And if you have reached out before, reach out again. The first time the person may not be receptive, but you want to keep trying and try talking to someone else or with a professional and engage others in that conversation as well. And even if suicide turns out not to be a concern, they may still be in distress and they may feel comforted and supported just knowing that you care and you took the time to listen. And so when you do reach out, here's how you can do that. The first thing you want to do is talk to them in private. If you're in a classroom setting, pulling them aside or into the hallway. If you're at home, talking to them in private. And then you want to listen to their story, express concern and caring, and ask directly about suicidal thoughts. Don't be afraid to ask the question, are you thinking of ending your life? Are you thinking about suicide? There's this myth out there that if you ask that question, you're putting the idea in the person's head. But what we know is that asking that question lets that person know that you care. It lets them know that you've noticed that they might be experiencing distress, and it lets them know that you're a safe person to talk to about it. And then you want to encourage them to seek mental health services and perhaps accompany them when receiving those services. And so there's some things you also want to avoid when talking with somebody who might be in crisis. You want to avoid minimizing their feelings. Those of us who have never experienced major depression or a suicidal crisis cannot imagine what that feels like. And for them in that moment, those feelings are real, those feelings are valid. And so you want to validate what they're experiencing and make sure not to minimize their feelings. You also want to avoid trying to convince them that life is worth living. We know that when a person is nearing this crisis point, they're not thinking clearly, and philosophical debates and cliches about the meaning of life and life being worth living tend not to be helpful because they're, again, in this state of intense tunnel vision. And so what that can actually do is sort of increase guilt. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're really trying to talk them through what they're currently experiencing. And then you also want to avoid advice to fix it. This is one of the things I struggled with most when I started out in suicide prevention. I tend to be very solution oriented, but if the person I think about it, if you're having a conversation with a person who's having a heart attack, you wouldn't tell them to start exercising or to eat a healthier diet. You would just get them through that crisis situation. And that is what your role is in this conversation. And then if they are in crisis, what they need is to be heard and then led to help. So listen to their story, offer to help, and then help them to find a mental health professional or connect them with somebody who can. Help them to take active steps toward keeping their environment safe as well. And if you think somebody might make an attempt on their life soon, it's important to stay with them and do not leave them alone unless the situation puts your own safety at risk. Help them to remove lethal means and help them to remove potentially dangerous materials or remove them from a potentially dangerous area. And escort them to mental health services or an emergency room if you feel that that's necessary. This is probably the most important slide in the entire deck here is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can help a person to call the Lifeline, or you yourself can call the Lifeline, and a trained counselor will help you to tell you what you should do to help a person who might be in distress. And if they don't feel comfortable speaking to a counselor on the phone, they can also text the crisis line to 741-741. They can text the word talk to 741-741. And so I would encourage you to store these phone numbers in your phone. Hopefully you'll never need to use them, but having them available just in case is always a great idea. And I'll emphasize that both of these are free resources. They're available 24/7, 365 days a year, and they're all answered by trained crisis professionals. And as always, if it's an emergency, such as an immediate suicide attempt in progress, I encourage you to call 911, while also recognizing that this may not be a safe response for every community. So use your best judgment in determining whether this is a safe response. But I will say that in the local Lansing area, we have been working with law enforcement to provide crisis intervention training. And so many law enforcement officers in the Lansing area are trained in how to respond to a mental health crisis. And we are working on legislation as well to increase mobile crisis units in the state of Michigan that we can send to those who might be experiencing a crisis. So trained social workers and mental health providers can respond to those sorts of calls. So together we can create a culture that's smart about mental health. Will save lives, will vastly improve the lives of many more. And that's really what our whole organization is about. It's a simple yet powerful idea. Talk saves lives. By caring and reaching out, we can all play a part in suicide prevention. Thank you so much for joining this presentation. I will mention that we have a number of events coming up and a number of resources on our website, so feel free to visit our website at afsp.org. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Standley. Excellent presentation. We have a few questions. The first question is, in the earlier part of the presentation, you mentioned something about all students having the suicide number on the back of their ID cards. You talk a little more about how that plan will be rolled out?
Yeah, so that was legislation we worked with State Representative Schroeder on last year. That was signed into law late in 2020. And so for the upcoming academic year, public schools in the state of Michigan who serve students in grades 6 through 12 will be required to print a suicide prevention hotline phone number on all student ID cards. That legislation also requires schools to display suicide prevention materials in their schools that will be provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. So this is just, one way to get resources out there. And we have seen a number of other states introduce similar legislation as well. And so this is not something that's going to increase costs for schools or anything because they're printing student IDs anyway. But it is something that we're excited about. And private academies and schools will also have the option to do that as well. But it will be mandated for public schools.
Wow, that's an excellent resource. I wanted to ask also, after COVID, we returned back to school face-to-face. I know you went over some of the warning signs and triggers, but what should a teacher or support staff member's first step be if they recognize any type of potential suicidal ideation in a kid? What should that first step be? So we're not, jumping the gun, or, what should that first step look like?
Yeah, I think that first step is just pulling that student aside and having a conversation. We certainly don't want to elevate a situation if it's not necessarily a suicidal crisis by, immediately referring a student, but just pulling them aside and having a conversation. I've noticed that you've been exhibiting XY behaviors. I noticed you said, you said this last week. And so I just wanted to reach out and see if you're okay and kind of start with that conversation. And if you continue to be concerned, ask that question about, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about ending your life? And then from there, you can determine sort of the next course of action in terms of referring to a counselor or the appropriate person in the school.
So in the event that a student states that they do have a plan of action to commit suicide and we are unsuccessful locating a parent, what is the next step?
Yeah, in that situation, you definitely want to refer them to a mental health professional if the school has a mental health professional, or engage the parent or the principal in referring them to local crisis services. For example, Community Mental Health Authority of Clinton, Eaton, and Ingham County has a youth crisis center that will send a mobile crisis unit for students who might be in crisis. So that would probably be the next step.
Thank you. I think that's great information for all of us to have as administrators and teachers. We've all been in situations where, let's say, a student is talking about suicide towards the end of the day. So we're concerned about putting them on the bus, et cetera, we can't reach a parent. So I think that's a really good information. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, all of our participants, parents, community stakeholders for joining us. Thank you very much, Mr. Standley, for this phenomenal presentation. We greatly appreciate it. We appreciate the support of the Parent University. This was a very timely and needed presentation, especially during COVID. I know we've seen a spike in the number of incidences of adults and children expressing ideation. So we appreciate you. Any final words, Mr. Standley, that you'd like to leave us with?
No, I would just say, you can always learn more about suicide prevention and get involved in suicide prevention at our website at afsp.org. And again, the more we can do to create a culture that's smart about mental health and talk about it, the more we can do to prevent it.
I'd like to put that in the chat. I'm sorry, did you say the website again?
Yes, it's afsp.org/Michigan.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We greatly appreciate everyone participating this evening. Everyone be safe, be healthy. Again, thank you very much, Mr. Standley. We appreciate your support as a key community partner with the Lansing School District.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Have a good evening.
You too.